Hey guys, Mr. Poke here, back with another video. So I'm finally back from overseas, glad to be back making Honkai Star Rail content again, and just in the nick of time because Luocha's banner released 2 days ago. It gave us around 2 days for the CN bros to cook up whatever they need to cook up for the units analysis. In this case, after overwhelming demand from my viewers, it looks like we'll be discussing not the 5-star rate up, but rather the 4-star Yukong instead of Luocha today. I personally think she's a really interesting unit, and I think the way of playing Yukong is very different from the majority of the Harmony units that we have right now. So I think it will be quite interesting to see what she brings to the table as well as how we operate her as a support. So without further ado, let's just jump into today's content. Before we even factor her support and DPS potential, we must first know that Yukong currently has the only technique in the game that increases running speed overall. So this makes her really valuable for people that want to do their daily farming from across all their 3 different worlds, as well as using her in Simulated Universe, because she basically just makes you run 35% faster, and this can be a huge time saver, especially for people that want to cut down the amount of time they want to spend doing this kind of farming, right? So just because of this alone, even getting a single copy of Yukong will be vastly beneficial for you if you want to keep farming in Honkai Star Rail. One thing to keep in mind is that we will be getting a free copy of Yukong at patch 1.2, so even if you do not really want Yukong right now, perhaps you don't really want to pull Luocha and you can't really be bothered with Yukong's Eidolons, then feel free to just sit back and wait for 1.2 and everybody will have a free copy of Yukong. And once you have the free copy, I think she'll be an incredible addition. Now with that out of the way, Yukong's release can also be signified as miHoYo pushing an underutilized playstyle, which is the sub DPS playstyle. Right, sub DPS is essentially a unit that doesn't only use E, right, but instead makes EA to maintain a net 0 SP usage while dealing respectable damage, right? So this allows us to have less pressure on our main DPS's skill points. So even though our main carry is going to be the one using E most of the time, because Yukong can essentially achieve a net 0, this will still allow our main DPS to input high amounts of damage by herself, even with Yukong in your team, right? So note that EA is not a new cycle. There has already been plenty of units that make use of this playstyle, such as Asta and Welt. They can both function really well with EA instead of just purely spamming A or E to achieve net 0 while providing both utility and damage. So Yukong just essentially opened up the visibility of this sub DPS playstyle. Right, and Yukong is also the first and only support that grants crit ratio buffs, and you guys know how incredibly powerful crit ratios can be because all endgame DPS attack scaling will depend on how good your crit ratio is. So for Yukong to provide both crit rate and crit damage on her ultimate is going to be a huge buff to your main carry's DPS, and this potentially allows our main DPS to transition into a crit damage main piece instead of a crit chance main piece, since she already provides almost the equivalent value of main stat crit chance. While on paper, Yukong's kit looks like she's a team-wide buffer because every single one of her skills, she says you buff your entire team with attack, crit damage or crit ratio, right? But really she's only meant to buff 2 units instead of all 4 units, right? The main DPS as well as the sub DPS, since her buffs dissipate after 2 unit turns, which is essentially her roaring bowstring, right? So this combined with her internal kit may see the rise of main DPS / sub DPS / healer and support in the future, instead of the traditional main DPS / tank and 2 support or main DPS / 3 support, right? So this opens up to a potentially new playstyle with Yukong, although this playstyle has already been in place, but Yukong just made this even more viable. Right? So that is the forward for Yukong. Now, before I get into what we want to talk about today, such as her Reddit recommendations, her Litecoin recommendations, and her team comps, here are some of the common misconceptions that players may have when playing Yukong, right? So, number 1, Roaring Bowstring, it is not consumed by follow-up attacks, ultimates, and Seele's Resurgence, right? So essentially, if you were to use a unit's ultimate while Yukong has only 1 stack left, and the next unit's turn is gonna make it into 0 stack, if you use it before her stack depletes, the unit's ultimate will still gain the benefit of the crit rate and crit damage, right? So this is also the same for follow-up attacks such as March 7th, Clara, as well as Seele's Resurgence. So all these kind of things will still be under the benefit of Roaring Bowstring as long as this bar is not at 0. Right? That's number 1. Number 2, Yukong's buffs, both her E and ultimate, they are not considered buffing an ally. They are considered buffing herself, because as you can see over here, right, the target for her buff, her E, is only for herself. But even though the target is on herself, the effect of this attack buff is for all allies. So how does this impact us, right? So this means that, so things such as Bronya's signature light cone, the effect of recovering 1 skill point when buffing allies, it will not be triggered with Yukong's ultimate, right? So she will not be able to recover 1 skill point using Bronya's light cone. Or Dan Heng's talent essentially says if he receives a buff from any ally, he will have an increased wind rest penetration, right? This will also not be affected by Yukong's buff, so it's just something to keep in mind. Number 3, Yukong's talent increases her basic attack percentage multiplier by a certain amount, and this triggers every alternate turn. I think this part is really easy to understand. However, the toughness reducing damage percentage. Now this line, it only increases the toughness bar damage, right? It doesn't increase the flat amount of damage dealt to the enemy, it's only the toughness bar, right? So instead of -1 toughness, as with every single unit's auto attack, it will now be -2 toughness if this talent is in place, which is essentially the same as most units' E skill, right? Most E skills, they -2 toughness, auto attacks -1, and your ultimate usually -3, right? So this is just a general guideline, right? Her toughness reducing damage percentage will not increase her final DPS. And lastly, although Yukong's E has a massive 80% attack buff and it helps charge her ultimate faster, it is extremely not recommended to just spam Yukong's E, right? Even though you want your main DPS to get a buff, you want the buff uptime to be as high as possible, it is really not recommended to just spam her E all the time, because this would be a massive skill point sink and leaving nothing for your main DPS. Because if your main DPS is going to be the one constantly using her E, then Yukong cannot be another person that is constantly using her E, because you're going to go into negative territories eventually, right? So the ideal cycle for Yukong, as mentioned in the forward over here, is using both her auto attacks as well as the skill, right? Since her auto attack already has the benefit of her talent, reducing toughness bars every alternate turn, then after using her auto attack and her talent is in the cooldown, then you can use her E to buff her and all her allies, and this can go vice versa, right? So for Yukong, most of the time, when you factor into our energy thresholds later on, you want to look at whether she can achieve her ultimate within 4 turns of using AE, right? This is essentially the main gist of Yukong. She's very different from most other supports such as Asta, Bronya, Tingyun, where she can just use one skill and spam all her auto attacks, or she can just keep spamming her skills such as Bronya. She wants a balance of both auto attack and skills, right? So these are just some of the things that we need to understand about Yukong before going forward. Yukong, her kit herself, she can easily be a T0 or T100 support, and it all depends on the speed tuning of the entire team. Because as we know from the effects of Roaring Bowstring, if the main DPS and sub DPS does not move within 2 turns of Yukong, which is essentially saying after 2 units go before the main DPS, then they will not receive any of Yukong's buff, even her ultimate buff. This is of course considering that you don't have Yukong at E6, right? Since it's tied to a skill. So as such, she has the highest demand for speed tuning in the entire game for all Harmony characters, right? Even though Bronya speed tuning, Asta, Tingyun, like this kind of stuff, they are good to get some form of speed tune, but for Yukong, it is like almost a must to speed tune. If you don't speed tune Yukong, then your main DPS or sub DPS will essentially never ever get Yukong's buff. So this essentially renders her as a Harmony support worthless, right? So speed tuning is really important on Yukong. But some potential issues with Yukong, right, when it comes to speed tuning, right? Her E1 grants her a 10% speed buff for 2 turns, which will definitely affect the turn order of your units, right? So for example, Yukong's base speed is 107, which is pretty high, and City's base speed is 115. After factoring in the 10% speed buff, which is based on your unit's base speed, they will now be at 117.7 and 162.5 respectively, right? Another thing to take note is any units that are running the volume exec, it will plus 40 action value in the first turn, so this will definitely also affect your turn order. So just some things to keep in note when you're trying to speed tune for Yukong, right? But since these effects only last for essentially 1 or 2 turns, it doesn't really impact us that much, but they should definitely still be noted by the players, right? So for speed tuning, there are 2 ways to go about speed tuning Yukong, either the fast Yukong or the slow Yukong, and I'll be talking about each of their respective speed tuning categories, right? So for fast Yukong, in this comp, Yukong will be the first within a team of 4, and your main DPS will be in the second or third, and your healer or tank will be the last, right? So if you're running a second support, such as Tingyun over here, then you must let them be faster than the main DPS, so that your main DPS will be a third. In this scenario, your main DPS will receive the buff from both Yukong as well as the secondary Harmony's character, right? So in this case, Yukong casting her E and Tingyun casting her E will allow Welt to receive the buff from both Yukong and Tingyun, right? However, if you're running a main DPS and a sub DPS comp, which essentially you don't really need a secondary support, then the order matters less. Just ensure that Yukong is always the fastest, and these 2 units in between will be between your main DPS and sub DPS. The order for these 2 units doesn't really matter that much, right? So as you can see from this little picture over here, a sample speed tuning can be Yukong into Tingyun into Welt and Luocha, right? So in this case, Welt will always receive Yukong's buff since he is within 2 turns of Yukong, and we want Tingyun to be faster than Welt, so he can also receive Tingyun's buff as well, right? So for the strength of this fast Yukong, it is very easy to speed tune, which essentially you just need to ensure Yukong will always be the first person in your team, and your main DPS isn't the slowest. So it's pretty easy to speed tune. But the weakness is you will have to force your tank or healer to be slower than your main DPS over here, which may affect skill point regeneration, because most of the time for our tanks and healers, like I've mentioned in all my previous videos, ideally I would want them to be on speed boots because they really help with skill point regeneration. And most of the times your healer and tanks, they won't really be using their skills that much and they will be auto attack most of the time, right? So this is less of an issue if you can speed tune within 2 to 3 speed of each other. So your tank or your healer can still run speed boots, but they are not that much slower compared to your main DPS. So that's that for weakness. Now for the slow Yukong speed tune. In this comp, Yukong will be the last in the team of 4, and your main DPS will be 1 or 2, and your healer and tank will be the third, right? It is also possible to have Yukong as your third over here. Your support is 4, your main DPS is 1, since this will still allow our main DPS to obtain both buffs from Yukong and the support over here, right? Now, if we're running a second support, such as a Harmony or Nihility unit like Tingyun, we need to let them be faster than the main DPS, so our main DPS is going to be a slot number 2 over here, and our support is going to be a slot number 1, right? If we're running a main or sub DPS, then the order will matter less, right? So this will be your main DPS, or this can be a sub DPS, these two, it doesn't really matter that much, as long as Yukong is the last member in your team, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind when using the slow Yukong comp is that your units will not receive any of Yukong's E buff because Yukong is going last, right? But to remedy this, then we'll have to use Yukong's technique to ensure that her buffs can still be applied to our main DPS, sub DPS in the very first turn, right? So for sample speed tuning, as seen over here, it's gonna be Tingyun into Welt into Luocha into Yukong, right? Welt will still receive Yukong's buff since within 2 turns of Yukong, and we want Tingyun to be faster than Welt so he can receive Tingyun's buff as well. It's the same theory as the fast Yukong comp, right? So the strength for this is, if we want Yukong to be the slowest member in the team, right, then we can allow our Yukong to use attack percentage boots, and this will grant her a higher personal DPS. But the weakness for this, of course, is going to be in high speed fights, especially in later MOC stages with 150 plus speed enemies. Then Yukong's buffs may not be able to keep up with the rest of the team, especially if you do not have E6 Yukong. Because if you do have E6 Yukong, then at least when you use her ultimate before the main carry's turn, then the main carry can still obtain Yukong's buff without needing Yukong to be super fast, right? But one thing to keep in mind after discussing both fast Yukong and slow Yukong is that there's a very big difference between expectations and reality when it comes to speed tuning in the game, right? So for both scenarios, they are not going to be perfect because of the different practical factors that can affect your team, such as crowd controls cast onto any of your unit, or any of your unit having some sort of speed buff or action value buff, and this is gonna ruin your speed tuning entirely, right? So as you can see from this little chart over here, our CN bro here wanted to speed tune Yukong in this format, which is Tingyun, Bailu, Yukong into Seele. So in this scenario, Tingyun can give Seele the buff, and Yukong can still give Seele the buff, and Seele is gonna eat the buff, right? But because Seele has her resurgence, has a speed boost, as well as even using her basic attack with Seele, right, she increases the action value. In this situation, most of the time, Seele is gonna slowly become faster than Yukong, and it's gonna become a situation like this, where Yukong is now slower than Seele. In this situation, Seele will no longer be able to have any of Yukong's buffs because she's now the third unit, and Yukong's buff can only be applied to Tingyun and Bailu. So this is going to be a huge problem for us when it comes to speed tuning. So this is just one example. Any of this is going to affect the speed tuning for our game, such as action bar manipulation, a speed decrease, a freeze, or imprisonment. They're all going to affect our speed tuning. Another thing to note is, there's a lot of units that we have in the game that affects their own action value or speed without even enemies affecting them, right? So as you can see this little list over here, Asta, Tingyun, Bronya, Hook, Himeko, Jingyuan, Qingque, Seele, Yanqing, Shu Shang, and Dan Ting, they all have some sort of speed buff or action value buff. So in this scenario, even if the enemy units are not crowd controlling your team, right, such as with imprisonment or freeze or any speed debuffs, when using these units, they're still gonna change the order of your speed tuning, because eventually, somehow or rather, Yukong will just no longer be in the same position as you were when you started the game, right? So considering both scenarios, E6 Yukong with attack percentage boots can have a higher DPS output while still maintaining buffs on the main DPS, right? So there's not much need for speed tuning, but you will need to use her ultimate on manual before the main DPS's turn, right? With Yukong that's less than E6, using speed boots with her can become more consistent in longer fights because essentially you can keep up with the amount of enemies in the MOC cycles, right? And considering the differences of expectation and reality, we have to know that Yukong, it is not going to be a very auto-friendly unit, right? So using E or A will definitely need to depend on the scenario. You cannot really auto with Yukong because the longer the fight drags out, the more differences your team's speed tuning is gonna be affected, right? So we just try to speed tune Yukong's team to the best of our abilities, but just do note that in most scenarios, this is not gonna be a constant throughout the entire fight, right? So we need to know when to use Yukong's E and when to use Yukong's auto attack. Yukong's energy threshold, I must say, it's really quite complex compared to all of my previous units' energy thresholds, right? Because her A6 trace provides her energy, and her E2 Eidolon also provides her energy. And Harmony Light Cones, they have a lot of light cones that provide them with energy, right? There's Coggers, there's Memory of the Past, there's Brilliant Light Cone, they all have some sort of energy values. So there's a lot more different thresholds when it comes to finding out what is Yukong's ideal benchmark when it comes to energy threshold, right? So to calculate this, I've compiled every single possible scenario that Yukong can be under the effect of, and I'll be splitting them against into E0 and E2, right? To make this a little bit simpler, I'm going to be assuming that your A6 is unlocked, and our maximum duration for our turns is going to be 4 turns, right? Anything more than 4 turns is not really part of my concern, because that means it's going to take way too long to out. So how much energy is required for Yukong to out within 4 turns, right? And also, as usual, we're not going to assume that she's going to get any hits or get any kill for herself, and there's a total of 16 different scenarios, and feel free to read this at your own time. There's a summary at the end of the day, so I'm just going to compile everything over here, and I'll be discussing this later on, right? So just some things to keep in mind. 普攻 is your basic attack, your 战绩 is your skill, and your 气壮次数 is basically the number of times Roaring Bowstring is active, right? So which is essentially means how many times your main carry can receive the buff. So you can read this at your own time. There's really quite a lot. There's like E0, E0 with 1 whack, E0 plus ER, E0 plus ER and 1 whack, E0 plus Coggers, Coggers with 1 whack, Coggers with ER, and Coggers with every single thing. And all this is repeated for E2. So really a lot of different scenarios. So you can just take a look at yourself. But the ones that I've highlighted in green over here essentially is the good benchmark for Yukong to try to hit, right? And I'll be explaining this momentarily over here. So for E0 Yukong, you want to be using an energy regeneration rope because this provides the best utility, allowing your Yukong to cast out every 4 turns using AEAE, right? So this can be seen over here. AAEE, okay, this is actually just the skills, right? But it can be, the order doesn't really matter. So it can be auto attack, skill for the maximum coverage, and you're gonna get 135 energy, which allows us to out within 4 turns, right? So this is gonna be a very good benchmark. So in comparison, why I say E0 plus energy regeneration rope is better, right? So if you take a look at E0 plus 1 whack, for example, but in this scenario, you have to use skill 3 times and auto attack once. And this is gonna cause us to have -2 SP, which is not gonna be ideal because we wanna give most of our SPs to our main carry. So this is not gonna be in a pretty good spot. And then if you wanna compare energy regeneration plus 1 whack, you can see that it's still the same. You still can out in auto attack, auto get skill, but now you can additionally out every 3 turns with skill. But like I mentioned previously at the very start of the video, it is extremely not recommended for Yukong to use her skills 3 times in a row because we're gonna have a -3 skill point, and this is gonna cause a huge issue for us when our main carry doesn't have enough skill points to do her damage, right? And then for all these Coggers calculation, right, I'm not recommending Coggers for Yukong at all. So even though Coggers allows us to, for example, Coggers plus ER, right, you can AAAE, it basically means you free up 1 skill point, but the thing with Yukong is you want her to use skill as well. You don't want her to be using auto attack all the time, right? Because especially considering that her trace has a cooldown of 1 turn. So even though now you can ultimate in 4 turns with just 3 auto attacks and 1 skill, but Yukong is somebody that wants to use a skill. So this is why Coggers is basically not really that. It's not that recommended for Yukong's kit per se. So that's with E0. Now with E2, the calculation is also over here, and the main thing to note is E2 with 1 whack or E2 with ER plus 1 whack. So in this scenario, as you can see over here, we can see that Yukong can now out within 4 turns using AAEE, right? Previously in E0, you can only do this with an ER rope, but now with 1 whack, you can already do this without using ER rope. So this frees up our ER rope to be an attack percentage, which can greatly increase Yukong's personal DPS capabilities. Another situation is using both ER rope and 1 whack for E2. In this scenario, you can now out every 3 turns with AEE, even though this is going to be in the negative skill point territory, but because this is only -1, it is still not that bad for us, and especially because if the fight is really short, right, like if you can clear MOC within like 5 turns, 4 turns, then this kind of energy deficiency won't really impact us that much, as long as you can ensure that our 2 other units, which is like your tank or your sub DPS, don't use any sort of skill points at all, then this setup is also perfectly fine for Yukong, right? So for E2, it's going to be 1 whack or ER plus 1 whack. Summary, for E0, we want to use ER rope because it provides the best utility, and this frees up our light cone to be planetary for our imaginary comps, as well as our 2-piece to be Salsoto/Fleetless, right? So we don't have to run Von Whack anymore if we're going to be going this route. Then for E2, like I mentioned just now, Von Whack alone will allow our Yukong to use AE out, so this frees up our root to be attack percentage and our planetary to be our light cone. And like I mentioned again, you can use AE out with Von Whack plus ER rope, although this is skill point negative, but it is only -1 as compared to -3 for EE, right? So this is also a possible scenario to consider. So that is essentially it for Yukong's energy thresholds. Now, Yukong, she's one of the only Harmony units so far in the game that has a respectable amounts of personal DPS, right? As compared to Bronya, Tingyun, and Asta, right? She's our very first Harmony unit that I would recommend actually building like a DPS set on her, right? So this is gonna be like a proper standard DPS set that you can essentially just use on Welt as well. A crit chance body, speed boots, imagine percentage orb, as well as ER rope. Why ER rope? You can just refer back to our energy thresholds, right? So this is a potential build for Yukong. And then some sort of substitutes, in case you don't really want to farm Imaginary Dungeon that much, you can easily just slap on Musketeer with the same exact main stats, and then you can also use Von Whack as well, depending on the energy threshold as mentioned previously in E0 or E2, right? So, why is this the case, right? Because Yukong has impressive personal DPS potential with a 380% damage ultimate multiplier, as well as being a support that intentionally wants to use basic attacks between skills. Like I mentioned, her talents, it allows us to do up to 80% additional damage. Coupling her offensive traces, because Yukong has a lot of attack percentage and imaginary damage percentage, building her with damage will then best utilize her overall kit, right? You want her to be doing as much damage as possible because she is capable of doing as much damage as possible without affecting her main primary objective, which is to support your main DPS, right? Now for ER rope, feel free to check out the energy threshold again as to why you want to use ER rope or when you want to use Von Whack, it is up to that. And Musketeer can also be considered, although the DPS potential is not going to be as high as Imaginary set. Although some people may say that Musketeer provides Yukong with more speed, right? And more speed is always going to be good, especially for fast Yukong. She really doesn't need to be super fast, right? As long as your speed tuning is sufficient, as long as your Yukong is going to go first before your main DPS, all that kind of stuff, then any excess speed on her is really not that impactful. So Musketeer set is definitely a possible set, but it's not going to be the best set for Yukong, right? Bandit is going to give you way more damage and way more utility on that kind of good stuff. So that is that for Yukong's relic recommendations. Super straightforward, just build her like a DPS with speed and you're done. Alright, so for Imaginary team, our Yukong is going to be wanting to run planetary above all other light cones. For general purpose, we can choose to run Bronya Light Cone above Carve the Moon / Dance. And for general purpose with perfect speed tuning, which essentially means your main carry is always after Yukong, then you can try to run Bronya Light Cone followed by Past and Future, because Past and Future's damage percentage at S5 is actually higher than Bronya's Light Cone. Right? So this is going to be pretty big in terms of damage increase. But why do I have an asterisk on Bronya's, right? Because like I mentioned earlier on in my common misconception, Bronya's Light Cone's skill point gain cannot be utilized by Yukong at all, right? And since every other Harmony unit in the game can make use of this incredibly useful SP gain, it will be much better to just give this Light Cone to our other Harmony units such as Bronya, Asta, and Tingyun, right? Even though the ER percentage and damage percentage can be very helpful for Yukong itself, right? But because we don't have like 10 copies of Bronya's Light Cone as opportunity cost, so ultimately when it comes down to who can utilize Bronya's Light Cone better, then I would say other Harmony units such as Bronya, Asta, or Tingyun can use Bronya's Light Cone better, and for Yukong herself, she can still make use of other excellent Harmony Light Cones such as Carve the Moon, Dance, and Planetary based on all the other situations, right? That being said, it is still a good Light Cone on Yukong because it has the highest amount of raw stacks provided, right? Because it's a 5-star gacha Light Cone. So if you want to build a DPS Yukong, then the attack offered by Bronya's Light Cone is still going to be very useful. But just keep in note that the SP generation is not going to be there for Yukong when you use Yukong's ultimate. And as such, only use Bronya's Light Cone if you are a whale and you have multiple copies of Bronya's Light Cone. Now, why do I not recommend Koggers or Memories of the Past? Because they are the Light Cones that generate a ton of energy, and we know how good Koggers is for a lot of other supports, right? Now, this is because it doesn't really fit with our energy threshold, because if you take a look at our energy threshold over here, even in the scenarios where we use Koggers or Memories, it is in a very weird spot because it doesn't allow us to really utilize Yukong's value, right? Because for example, over here in E2, if you use Koggers by ERO, you can now out with Yukong with just like 4 auto attacks, right? You don't use a single skill and you can cast your ultimate within 4 turns. But because Yukong wants to use her skill, right? She wants to use her skill as much as possible. you don't really want to be in a situation where Yukong don't use a skill at all. So our best balance for Yukong most of the time is going to be AE, such as the one highlighted in green over here. This allows us to have a net 0 skill point usage while still providing enough buffs for our team. That's why most of the time for Yukong, you want out within every 4 turns instead of every 3 turns. Right? Unless you're in a very short battle or you can kill the enemy really fast, so having a higher ultimate uptime can in fact increase your DPS for the short duration. But the longer the fight drags out, you're gonna face into skill point issues because you can't be using AEE forever. You're gonna -1, and eventually you're just not gonna be able to keep up. So that is that, right? Secondly, why I don't recommend using Coggers or Memories is because Yukong's E does not proc the +8 energy, right? Because if you look at their effect, right, it only happens when it is an attack. For Asta, is something that can be used because Asta's E is considered an attack, right? But Yukong's E is not, it's just considered buff. So when you use Yukong's skill, it actually does not plus the 8 energy, which makes Coggers or Memories of the Past value even lesser. So that's why me as well as the CN bros, they don't really recommend using this with Yukong. Now, finally, our final section is gonna be on team recommendations with Yukong. Currently, Yukong's strength can be best utilized when running with a main and sub DPS to fully utilize her buffs, right? So what I mean by fully utilize her buffs, we're gonna be referring to the chart below for the DPS comparison, right? So if you can take a look over here, in the traditional team comps, right, where you run only one main carry, such as Seele, in this example over here, you can see that Yukong's increase in damage, right, is only 159%, or roughly this amount, as compared to other Harmony units such as Bronya or Ting Yun. They both increase the main DPS of our main carry by a higher amount, right? 173 and 185 respectively. And even against Asta, I would say she's not as good as Asta, even though Asta has a much lesser increase, because Asta provides a very important speed buff. And you know, speed thresholds can be a huge lifesaver when you play against MOC 9 or MOC 10, where speed is crucial when you try to kill the enemy before your entire team passes away, right? So this is why, if you're gonna be running Yukong as the support for a team that only has one main DPS, then it is just much better to just run another Harmony support, such as Bronya, Ting Yun, or Asta, instead of running Yukong. So the biggest reason of why this is the case is because Yukong's kit buffs 2 units, right? Her kit buffs 2 units, and only buffs 2 units. So these buffs can only be utilized by the main DPS alone, right? If you were to run Yukong with another like 2 units that don't really want Yukong's buff, such as another tank, another support, another healer, then the crit damage, crit and attack percentage really don't matter that much. As compared to Bronya, Ting Yun, and Asta, right? Their buffs offer much more value than Yukong herself when running her in a 1 carry team comp. If we were to take a look at a 2 carry team comp, right? So main DPS plus a sub DPS. So for CM Bros example over here, their main DPS is going to be Seele, who is going to be using all the skill points, and our sub DPS is going to be Qingque, where essentially she can pretty much just don't use skill points at all and just keep auto attacking, use a follow-up attack, and all that kind of good stuff. In this scenario, when there's 2 DPS sources, right, Yukong's value is now higher than Bronya, Ting Yun, and Asta, right? She's now the highest at 151%, slightly above Bronya and slightly above Ting Yun, right? So in this scenario, you can see that the value that you get out of Yukong is going to be a lot higher, since now 2 different units, and both of them being carried, can now make use of Yukong's 80% attack, 20% crit chance, and 65% crit damage buff, all at level 10, right? If you were to do this with Ting Yun or Bronya, only one main DPS can really get the buffs, so a sub DPS is going to suffer a little bit. But that's not the case for Yukong, because she can now buff both units, right? So in comparison, as you can see over here, from supporting a single carry of only achieving this amount, which is the amount that we get from supporting a single carry, she now provides a lot higher damage buffs when she's placed in a team with 2 damage sources, right? A main carry and a sub carry, a main DPS and a sub DPS, right? So because of this, the main / sub DPS team comp, this whole team comp, fits really well, especially when you want to use Yukong with an imaginary / quantum comp, right? So for those of you that want to compare this with like a traditional gacha game, it's like light dark comp, right? Because they both have excellent sub DPS sources, such as Welt, Steel Wolf, or Qingque. They can all be played as a sub DPS or a main DPS, up to you, compared to all other elements. Right? For example, if you want to play like Wind, you really only have Danheng at the moment until Blade comes out. And then if you want to play Ice, Yanqing is really our only main carry, unless you want to build a sub DPS Pella, which is not going to be as ideal as compared to Imaginary and Quantum, right? And this also allows Silver Wolf to easily mark the right element against any enemy, as long as you run Imaginary / Quantum comps. But This whole comp, right, I'm going to be discussing this in another separate video because I think this is going to be very, very interesting to see whether this game really has some sort of like special light dark synergy, because as we know, Honkai Star Rail doesn't really have any sort of special benefits in the light element or dark element compared to other traditional gacha games. But we can see that with the release of Yukong as well as Luocha, right, this might not be the case anymore, and Imaginary / Quantum Comp can be potentially a super flexible team that you can use anywhere, but that is for another video. Alright, so just gonna circle back a little bit. You can see how Yukong can be used for imaginary team such as Welt, QQ, Yukong and Luocha. In this kind of situations, you can just use her as Welt being the main DPS, QQ being the sub DPS, and Yukong can just buff both of them. If not, you can also run a double quantum, double imaginary team with Seele, Silver Wolf, and Yukong Luocha over here. So Yukong is gonna buff both Seele and Silver Wolf, and both of them have incredible DPS potentials, right? They're not just purely there for supports. So these are just some of the team recommendations that you can run with Yukong for a main DPS / sub DPS team. So with that, we've come to the 5th episode of CN Unit Analysis featuring Yukong. I think the bottom line is Yukong as a character herself, she really is very different from a lot of Harmony units, because number one, she's definitely not somebody that you can use to full auto. Because as we know, Star Rail's AI is not exactly the brightest, and they'll probably just spam all her skills and all the auto attacks, and because of how speed tuning, as we have mentioned just now, expectations versus reality, speed tuning is not going to be achieved at 100% uptime, so eventually you're going to reach a stage where Yukong's buff will no longer affect your main DPS. So for Yukong herself, if you really want her to shine, I would highly recommend using her on manual, especially for harder difficulties in MOC or even like Simulator Universe, this kind of stuff, right? So that's one. And number two, Yukong is also the first Harmony unit that I can say you can build her as a pure DPS, like with all DPS sets, and she can still do her job perfectly well. In fact, she can do her job even better because of how much damage possibilities you can get out of Yukong's kits, right? Her ultimate has such a high multiplier, her tracers, her talents all have some sort of increased damage for Yukong, right? Her basic kit is meant to be played as somebody that uses both skills and auto attacks to increase her overall efficiency. Alright, so that's all for today, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.